Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine it is the year 1940.
A pretty tense time to be writing about the future.
Oh, absolutely. The world is basically on the brink of this massive global catastrophe, but you are a science fiction writer, you're sitting at your typewriter, and you decide to look far past the immediate horizon.
Right.
You write a story about the distant future. And in this story, you predict that a backwoods preacher will leverage mass communication to get himself democratically elected president of the United States.
Which is already a bold claim for 1940.
Yeah, it is. And you set this pivotal election in the year 2012.
That's the part that always gets people.
It's wild. You then write that by the year 2016, no further elections are held at all. The democratic experiment is just completely dismantled, and America is plunged into a totalitarian theocracy.
It is an absolutely chilling piece of future casting. I mean, when you look at Robert A. Heinlein's novella, this goes on.
Yeah.
The sheer audacity of picking those specific years, 2012 and 2016, for the collapse of American democracy, it's enough to make anyone do a double take.
Oh, for sure.
But what makes this piece of literature worth a deep dive for us today isn't just a spooky coincidence of dates.
Right.
It is the incredibly rigorous, almost sociological approach Heinlein took to explaining how such a collapse happens, and more importantly, the gritty bureaucratic reality of how an underground resistance might actually go about overthrowing it.
Yeah, and that's exactly our mission for today. We are dissecting a massive, interconnected fictional universe today. The goal is to extract the core narrative of, if this goes on, figure out the political theorizing that's really fueling it, and see how it fits into Heinlein's overarching future history timeline.
Which is a massive undertaking.
It really is. And crucially, we're going to look at what makes a fictional revolution actually feel plausible. Because, as anyone who reads science fiction knows, authors usually treat revolutions like magic tricks.
Oh yeah, the spontaneous uprising trope.
Exactly. A bunch of oppressed people suddenly grab pitchforks, they storm the castle, and everyone lives happily ever after. Heinlein didn't buy that for a second.
He certainly did not. And as we navigate this, I think we should establish a clear analytical lens for you, the listener.
Very important, yeah.
Heinlein was writing this while grappling with his own intense mid-20th century anxieties about political extremes. He was specifically looking at the rise of fundamentalist and evangelical sects of his era, and he was exploring a worst-case scenario where those movements weaponized state power.
Right.
So our goal today is to decode how Heinlein channeled those specific historical fears into his world building. We are examining his dystopian laboratory as an artifact of its time, looking impartially at the mechanics of his fictional theocracy and the academic reception of his work, rather than viewing it as a direct commentary on today's landscape.
A completely necessary framing, because the world he builds is intensely bleak. I mean, we really are just analyzing the source material here.
Exactly.
So let's sketch out the boundaries of this theocracy. The novella basically drops us into a future America ruled by a succession of leaders who carry the title of prophets. Capital P, yes. They enforce this militant, omnipresent version of fundamentalist Christianity. But the architect of this entire nightmare is a man named Nehemiah Scudder, the first prophet.
Right. And Scudder is really the phantom haunting the entire future history timeline. He begins his career as this charismatic, backwoods preacher who slowly builds a massive populist following.
He's basically building a cult of personality.
Exactly that. He uses that momentum to legitimately win the presidential election in 2012. But he doesn't just dismantle the government overnight. There is a very methodical consolidation of power.
It's step by step.
Yes. By 2016, the mechanisms for voting simply cease to function. The republic is dead, and the era of the prophets begins.
But wait, how does a fringe preacher actually dismantle the U.S. Constitution in just 4 years? I mean, the lore has to explain the mechanics of that. People don't just willingly surrender their right to vote because a guy on television gives a good sermon.
No, they don't.
There had to be a foundational crack in the society that made them vulnerable to that kind of authoritarian shift. Right?
That is exactly where Heinlein's macroeconomic world building comes into play, and it is fascinating. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the rise of Nehemiah Scudder makes terrifying sense when you zoom out to the broader future history series.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Scudder's election was catalyzed by severe, systemic, societal disruptions caused by what Heinlein termed the new imperialism.
Right, the new imperialism. This connects to his other stories, like The Man Who Sold the Moon and Logic of Empire.
Yes.
Where humanity actually figures out practical interplanetary travel. But in Heinlein's universe, Europe has essentially been wiped off the map by a series of devastating wars.
Something he calls the final blackout.
Right, the final blackout, and then later conflicts with Great China. So America is the sole proprietor of the solar system. They own space.
Which sounds like a golden age, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But Heinlein portrays it as a gilded nightmare. The new imperialism is characterized by this hyper-capitalist expansion that completely breaks the domestic economy. You have staggering wealth being extracted from the solar system, but it is concentrated in the hands of a tiny, tiny elite.
And everyone else gets left behind.
Exactly. Back on Earth, the working class is subjected to intense economic dislocation, resulting in subsistence-level wages. The American dream effectively evaporates.
And it is even more horrific off-world. I mean, if you look at the laborers who are actually sent to colonize Venus, they are subjected to literal slavery.
Outright slavery.
They are entirely disenfranchised, treated as disposable machinery for this new imperial engine.
So what you have is a powder keg, an immense economic disparity where the foundation is built on crushing domestic poverty and off-world enslavement.
A recipe for disaster.
The working class is desperate. They're entirely alienated from the political establishment, and they're furious. This massive economic failure triggers a series of violent revolutions around the year 2012.
That magic number again.
Yep. Uprisings in the United States, rebellions on the Venus colonies, and unrest in a location called Little America. These conflicts essentially break the back of interplanetary travel, plunging the world into a chaotic period known as the interregnum.
That is the perfect storm for a dictator. When an entire population can't feed their families and they watch a distant elite hoarding the wealth of the solar system, the institutions of democracy start to look like a luxury they can no longer afford.
Precisely. Scudder steps into the chaos of the interregnum, offering absolute divine certainty and a return to order. It's a profound observation on how economic despair paves the highway for theocrats.
It creates such a hyper-realistic backdrop for the narrative. Heinlein ensures that the dictatorship isn't just a sudden evil empire dropping out of the sky. It is the logical consequence of unchecked exploitation.
Yes, the dominoes fall exactly the way they would.
And that brings us to the actual plot of If This Goes On, which forces us to look at this macro-level nightmare through the eyes of someone trapped inside the machinery of the state.
Let's bring in our protagonist, John Lyle.
Yes, John Lyle. He is a junior army officer stationed in the capital, which the regime has renamed New Jerusalem.
And what is fascinating about John is that he doesn't start out as a plucky rebel.
Not at all.
He is the ideal citizen of the theocracy. He was born into the system, he is deeply devout, and he genuinely believes he is serving a holy cause.
Yeah, John Lyle operates in a state of carefully cultivated ignorance. He is a true believer.
For him to turn against the state, Heinlein knows that a political argument won't work. A pamphlet about economic disparity won't break a lifetime of religious conditioning.
No, it has to be personal.
The catalyst has to be deeply personal and deeply traumatic.
And it centers entirely around a woman named Sister Judith. She is newly inducted as one of the prophet's virgins. Now, the title alone tells you everything you need to know about how this society views women, but the reality is even more sinister.
The religious trappings of New Jerusalem are really just a thin veneer for the systemic exploitation of the vulnerable. Sister Judith is called upon to submit sexually to the prophet.
Which is just horrific.
The sheer trauma and hypocrisy of the demand completely break her. She faints from the shock. And because she fails to comply, the regime confines her to her quarters until she, in their words, sees the light.
It is a brutal, visceral demonstration of absolute power. And for John Lyle, who is falling in love with Judith, this is the cognitive dissonance that shatters his entire worldview.
It breaks the spell completely.
He suddenly realizes that the absolute moral authority of his universe, the prophet himself, is just a predator operating behind a pulpit.
The psychological pivot for John is immediate. He transitions from a loyalist to a man experiencing a profound crisis of faith. He is isolated, he's terrified, and suddenly aware that he is serving a monstrous regime.
He needs an anchor, and he finds one in his roommate, Zeb Jones.
Zeb's great.
Zeb is a phenomenal foil to John. He is also in the military. But where John is naive and devout, Zeb is incredibly cynical and worldly. When John finally breaks down and confesses what is happening to Judith, Zeb doesn't even blink.
He already knows the prophet is corrupt.
Right. Zeb is the pragmatic bridge. John needs to survive his awakening. John has the moral outrage, but Zeb has the street smarts.
More importantly, Zeb is the one who understands how to navigate the shadows of New Jerusalem. Through Zeb, they connect with Sister Magdalene, a friend of Judith's, who is secretly operating as a member of the underground revolutionary movement known as the Cabal.
And from the moment they make contact with the Cabal, the pacing of this novella just goes into overdrive.
It really does.
It turns into an incredibly dense, pulpy espionage thriller. John and Judith try to arrange a clandestine meeting to figure out an escape plan, but the surveillance state is everywhere. They are cornered by an informant, and in the ensuing struggle, they are forced to kill the spy.
The stakes instantly elevate. It goes from ideological disillusionment to capital murder in a heartbeat.
Yeah, no going back after that.
Exactly. John and Zeb are formally inducted into the Cabal, but they are ordered to maintain their positions within the army. They are thrust into a high-wire act, living a double life in the heart of the enemy's military apparatus.
But the regime's secret police are competent. This isn't a cartoon where the bad guys are bumbling idiots.
No, they're very good at their jobs.
They investigate the dead spy, they connect the dots, and they arrest Sister Judith. The state tortures her. John and Zeb are forced to launch a desperate improvisational rescue mission.
Which is so chaotic.
It's incredibly messy. They manage to extract Judith from the interrogation cells, but they leave a forensic trail that leads the authorities directly back to John.
Because Heinlein refuses to give his characters easy victories. Every action has a realistic consequence. John is subsequently arrested and subjected to the exact same torture.
Right.
The narrative emphasizes the physical and psychological toll of rebellion. John manages to endure the interrogation without breaking, but his survival is entirely dependent on a covert distress signal he managed to leave for Zeb before the secret police kicked his door down.
And the Cabal utilizes that signal to execute a massive coordinated raid to rescue John from the torture chambers. It is classic breathless pulp action.
It is.
But here's where it gets really interesting. This is the exact moment where Heinlein takes all those standard 1940s pulp tropes and just completely subverts them.
Right, because you were reading this in 1940. The narrative architecture strongly suggests a specific resolution. The brave soldier endures torture to save the damsel in distress.
And then what happens?
The natural, expected reward for that heroism is her eternal devotion.
You fully expect the grand romantic reunion. John wakes up, wounded but victorious, and Judith falls into his arms.
But that is not what happens at all.
Not even close. After the rescue, John is unconscious for a significant period. The Cabal, operating with ruthless efficiency, smuggles Judith entirely out of the country for her own safety.
They don't wait for him to wake up.
No. When John finally recovers, he is handed a fake identity and has to make a harrowing cross-country journey to the Cabal's secret headquarters. He endures all these misadventures, he finally arrives, and instead of a reunion, he is handed a literal Dear John letter.
It is a brilliantly subversive choice by Heinlein. Judith writes to tell him that she made it to Mexico, found a safe haven, met a Mexican man, and is getting married.
She moved on.
She has chosen to build a normal life away from the trauma of the theocracy.
Which is such a grounded human reaction. I mean, she isn't a prize to be won by the protagonist. She is a deeply traumatized survivor who just wants peace.
Yes.
It leaves John completely bewildered. He is standing there holding this letter, trying to process that his grand romantic arc just evaporated.
And meanwhile, the reader assumes, okay, if John and Judith aren't the main couple, then Zeb and the fiercely competent Sister Magdalene are clearly going to pair off.
That's a backup romance, obviously.
Right. But Heinlein dissects that assumption as well. Zeb and Magdalene are both highly dominant, forceful personalities. They evaluate their dynamic and reach a purely practical conclusion.
Which is?
If they get married, they will constantly fight for control and make each other miserable. They actively choose to remain colleagues rather than force a romantic relationship that doesn't make psychological sense.
So John and Magdalene end up together.
Yeah.
They are both stationed at the Cabal headquarters, working under the revolutionary commander, General Huxley. They spend time together. They realize their temperaments actually complement each other perfectly, and they fall in love. They get married right before the final military assault on New Jerusalem.
It is an incredibly pragmatic, mature way to handle romance in a genre that usually treats it as an afterthought.
Or a trophy.
Exactly. It emphasizes that these are people living in a pressure cooker. They are making life-altering decisions based on compatibility and shared purpose, not narrative convenience.
That pragmatism extends to the climax of the story, too. The Cabal launches a highly coordinated military uprising, systematically seizing control of the outer territories from the Prophet's loyalist forces.
The final hurdle is New Jerusalem itself. The revolutionary forces who, interestingly, are described as being psychologically conditioned to value individual freedom above all else, they lay siege to the capital.
And during the chaos of the urban warfare, General Huxley is critically wounded. John Lyle, despite being a relatively junior officer, finds himself as the highest-ranking, capable man in the command center.
He has to step up.
He has to take temporary command and issue the decisive tactical orders that break the loyalist defenses.
And he demonstrates extreme competence under fire, secures the victory, and then immediately relinquishes command to the proper authorities.
He doesn't try to make himself the new dictator.
No, he hands it right back. He then leads an elite strike team directly into the prophet's inner sanctum to capture Nehemiah Scudder.
So you are primed for the final boss fight, John kicking down the door to confront the tyrant who ruined his life. But when they breach the private quarters, the room is already a bloodbath.
They find Nehemiah Scudder dead.
He hasn't been killed by the Grand Revolutionary Army. He has been viciously torn apart by his own virgins.
It is a stunning, poetic subversion of the hero's journey. The protagonist doesn't get to slay the dragon.
No.
The dictator who built his entire empire on the systemic abuse and subjugation of women is ultimately destroyed by the very people he victimized. The women locked in the gilded cage reclaim their agency in the most visceral, violent way imaginable.
It denies Scudder a dignified political death. He dies as a monster cornered by his victims. It's brilliant.
It really is.
Now, I want to pull back from the plot for a moment and look at the actual machinery of this revolution, because this is where Heinlein's genius really shines.
Logistics.
The logistics. How does the Cabal actually function? The source material highlights a very specific detail here. The Cabal uses terminology, organizational structures, and covert signals that are deeply associated with Freemasonry.
Right.
There are heavy implications that the Masons themselves are the core scaffolding of this revolt.
This is perhaps the most sociologically astute element of the entire novella. The text notes that Heinlein himself was never a Mason, though he considered joining in his youth. But his decision to use a fraternal order as the blueprint for an underground resistance is an absolute masterstroke.
And to appreciate why this is so brilliant, we have to look at how other authors handled this. Damon Knight, a highly respected sci-fi critic, wrote a phenomenal analysis of this in his 1967 book, In Search of Wonder.
Oh, I love this quote.
He explicitly calls out the genre's lazy habits. Quote, "Revolution has always been a favorite theme in science fiction. It's romantic, it's reliable, and as a rule, it's as phony as a Martian princess." End quote.
Knight is addressing a fundamental flaw in utopian and dystopian fiction. Authors frequently rely on the spontaneous uprising. The idea that a million disparate, terrified people will simultaneously decide to revolt without any central coordination.
Right.
Knight praises Heinlein for recognizing that, as he puts it, a modern revolution is big business.
Think about the sheer logistics of trying to overthrow a mass surveillance state. If neighbors are financially incentivized to report on each other, you cannot build a secret network from scratch.
The moment you try to recruit a stranger, the secret police will infiltrate you.
Exactly. You need secure communication channels, you need blind drops, compartmentalized cells, and a rigorous vetting process.
You need a pre-existing bureaucracy of secrecy. You need a hierarchy that people already trust with their lives.
And Knight asks the rhetorical question, quote, "Who but Heinlein would have seen that fraternal organizations, for 30 years the butt of highbrow American humor, would make the perfect nucleus for an American underground against tyranny?"
It is brilliant. The secret police are scouring the dark alleys looking for hardened, grizzled revolutionaries. And meanwhile, the guys organizing the coup are down at the local lodge wearing aprons, doing secret handshakes, and planning a charity pancake breakfast.
They already have the infrastructure for closed meetings, absolute discretion, and deep loyalty.
Here is the core insight Heinlein stumbled upon. Tyranny doesn't fear the lone hero. It fears pre-existing bureaucracy.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
The true threat to a dictator isn't a guy with a gun. It's a civic organization that already knows how to keep its meeting minutes a secret. Whether it is a labor union, a tightly knit religious minority, or a fraternal lodge, revolutions require an existing social fabric that can be weaponized against the state.
What stands out to you, listening to this, about how rebellions are organized in the real world versus in fiction? It completely reframes how you look at the mundane organizations in your own community.
It really does.
This level of logistical detail is exactly why, if this goes on, has such incredible staying power. Just recently, in 2024, The Economist published a retrospective on the novel.
Yeah?
They summarized it perfectly, calling it a peculiar mixture of pulpy action and political theorizing.
And that political theorizing was not merely an academic exercise for Heinlein. When he expanded the novella for republication in the 1953 collection Revolt in 2100, he included a massive postscript.
A fascinating document.
This document is a raw nerve. It lays out the exact real-world anxieties that compelled him to construct this timeline.
The Economist quotes heavily from this postscript. Heinlein wrote, quote, "There is a latent, deep strain of religious fanaticism in America. It is rooted in our history, and it has broken out many times in the past."
He was observing the socio-political climate of the mid-20th century, specifically tracking a sharp rise in evangelical movements that he viewed as deeply concerning.
He explicitly described these movements as holding beliefs that were theocratic in the extreme, anti-intellectual, anti-scientific, and anti-libertarian.
Right, he was terrified by the prospect of a populace willfully abandoning critical thought in favor of absolute dogma.
He encapsulates that fear in one of the most haunting sentences I have ever read from an author. Quote, "The capacity of the human mind for swallowing nonsense and spewing it forth in violent and repressive action has never yet been plumbed."
It is a relentlessly dark assessment of mass psychology. He is essentially arguing that human beings have a near-infinite bandwidth for self-delusion if it provides them with a sense of righteous certainty.
And looking at how academia has digested this text over the decades, that psychological cynicism is a major focal point. The source material outlines how scholars have dissected if this goes on from multiple angles.
Primarily, academia recognizes it as a pioneering early critique within science fiction of religion functioning as a hegemonic social tool.
Which was unusual for the time.
Very. The genre had largely ignored religion up until this point, focusing instead on engineering marvels or secular fascist dystopias. Heinlein introduced the idea that faith could be industrialized and deployed as a mechanism for absolute social control.
And we should reiterate, he wasn't critiquing the spiritual concept of a higher power.
No, not at all.
I mean, John Lyle remains a moral, faithful man throughout the story. He was critiquing the institution of the church, merging with the violence of the state.
Exactly. There is also a strong feminist critique applied to the work. When you analyze the prophets' virgins, it is a stark, horrific depiction of patriarchal abuse cloaked in divine mandate. The fact that the story resolves with the virgins violently dismantling their systemic oppressor reinforces this reading. They aren't saved by the male protagonist. They eradicate the source of their subjugation themselves.
It is a foundational text that drastically expanded the thematic boundaries of speculative fiction. But to truly appreciate its weight, we have to look at what happens after the revolution.
Right, the aftermath.
Because the novella does not exist in a vacuum. It is the fulcrum upon which the rest of the future history universe turns. The aftermath is chronicled in the novella Methuselah's Children, which picks up approximately 50 years after John Lyle and the Cabal overthrow the Theocracy.
And in the wake of the dictatorship, society establishes a new framework for government called the Covenant.
The Covenant.
The Covenant is designed as an immunological response to Nehemiah Scudder. It is a somewhat idealized structure aimed at providing the absolute maximum amount of individual freedom, ensuring that no theocrat can ever consolidate power again.
But the most fascinating aspect of the Covenant isn't its legal code. It is the underlying science they use to safeguard the society.
Yes, this is where things get wild. Heinlein postulates that the ultimate defense against tyranny is the rigorous application of the science of semantics.
Semantics?
The lore explicitly states that the prophets could never have taken power in 2012 if a science of semantics had been established beforehand.
What exactly does he mean by semantics in this context? Because he isn't just talking about, reading a dictionary or arguing over the definition of a word.
No, he is drawing heavily from Alfred Korzybski's theory of general semantics, which was very influential in mid-century science fiction.
Okay.
In this context, semantics is treated as a rigorous, almost mathematical discipline of language and critical thinking. The idea is that demagogues like Scudder rely on emotionally loaded, imprecise language to manipulate the masses.
Right.
They use words that trigger fear and tribalism rather than convey factual reality.
So if you train an entire population in general semantics, you are basically inoculating them against propaganda. You teach them to instantly deconstruct a politician's speech, strip away the emotional manipulation, and analyze the raw logical assertions underneath.
Exactly. A populace trained in semantics cannot be hypnotized by populist rhetoric. They become hyper-resistant to the swallowing of nonsense. Heinlein envisions a utopian defense mechanism based entirely on extreme media literacy and linguistic precision.
Which is an incredibly optimistic view of human potential.
It is.
But because Heinlein is deeply cynical about the permanence of any political system, the utopia of the covenant begins to fracture.
Of course it does.
In Methuselah's Children, the society faces a new existential panic involving a marginalized subgroup of humans known as the Howards. These are people who have been selectively bred for extreme longevity.
And when the society feels threatened by the existence of the Howards, the principles of the covenant are instantly suspended. The new enlightened government violently reverts to the exact same tools of oppression used by the prophets.
They authorize the use of torture.
Yes, they authorize the use of torture to extract the supposed secret of immortality from the Howards.
It is a brutal demonstration of cyclical history. The revolutionaries who overthrew the torturers build a utopia, and 50 years later, their grandchildren turn the torture chambers back on.
It is a sobering thesis. The mechanics of tyranny are never truly eradicated. They just lie dormant, waiting for a new crisis to justify their use.
It underscores the fragility of systemic safeguards so perfectly. And speaking of fragility, there is a fascinating layer of literary history surrounding this timeline. Specifically, the stories Heinlein conceptualized, but ultimately refused to write.
I am obsessed with these literary ghosts.
They're amazing. The future history timeline is massive, but there are massive gaps in it that Heinlein deliberately left blank. For example, there is a title on his timeline called The Sound of His Wings.
Right.
This was intended to be the prequel, the deep dive into the exact psychological and political rise of Nehemiah Scudder.
Yet Heinlein never drafted a single page of it. In the afterword to Revolt in 2100, he bluntly stated, quote, "I will probably never write the story of Nehemiah Scudder. I dislike him too much."
He just couldn't do it.
He conceptualized a villain so repugnant, so antithetical to his own core values, that the prospect of inhabiting Scudder's mind for the length of a novel was genuinely repulsive to him.
And there's another abandoned project titled The Stone Pillow. This one was supposed to chronicle the early, foredoomed opposition to the Theocracy, the brave individuals who fought against Scudder before his power was absolute, and who were inevitably crushed.
Heinlein walked away from that one as well, offering a heartbreaking justification. He noted that there was simply, quote, "too much tragedy in real life."
Wow.
You have to remember the context. He is developing this in the late 1930s and early 1940s. He is watching the very real rise of fascism and totalitarianism consume Europe.
He couldn't stomach the emotional toll of writing a story where the brave resistance fails, because he was terrified he was watching it happen on the evening news.
He desperately needed the catharsis of, if this goes on, a timeline where the resistance actually wins and the dictator ends up dead on the floor.
But this entire discussion of timelines was completely upended by an incredible discovery in 2003.
This is one of the greatest plot twists in science fiction literary history.
Truly.
For decades, academia believed, If This Goes On, was Heinlein's earliest novel-length work. But in 2003, a lost manuscript was uncovered. It was Heinlein's truly unpublished first novel, written in 1939, titled For Us, the Living, a Comedy of Customs.
And the craziest detail is that Nehemiah Scudder exists in this 1939 manuscript as well.
He does.
But the outcome of his political career is completely different. In For Us, the Living, Scudder makes his populist run. He gets dangerously close to seizing absolute power, but at the 11th hour, he is defeated.
Stopped in his tracks.
A coalition of citizens, organized under the banner of the libertarians, manages to mobilize and stop his theocratic takeover.
This presents a massive, glaring contradiction. Why, in 1939, does Heinlein write a timeline where America survives Scudder, but just 1 year later, in 1940, he creates the future history timeline where America falls to him? What changed in the world building?
The source material brings in a brilliant piece of analysis to answer this. In 2008, a scholar named Ward Carson published a paper attempting to reconcile these two distinct timelines. Carson looked at the variables and found the key difference: the timeline of space travel.
This raises an important question. Carson points out that in the unpublished 1939 manuscript, For Us, the Living, space colonization is significantly delayed. Humanity doesn't make major strides into the solar system until the end of the 21st century.
Right.
As a result, the population remains largely earthbound, and Scudder is defeated.
But in the 1940 future history timeline, the one that contains The Man Who Sold the Moon and the New Imperialism space colonization happens a full century earlier.
Yes.
And in this timeline, Scudder wins.
Carson theorizes a direct causal connection between early space colonization and the collapse of American democracy. His hypothesis centers on the concept of a massive sociological brain drain.
This theory completely blew my mind. Carson argues that in the future history timeline, the boldest, most individualistic frontier-seeking citizens, the exact demographic with the temperament to aggressively resist a theocratic dictator, they all packed up and emigrated to the moon and Venus.
The mass exodus of the pioneers structurally weakened the home world.
Yes.
The pursuit of the new frontier stripped America of its most fiercely independent thinkers, leaving behind a population that was statistically more complacent, more vulnerable to economic despair, and far more susceptible to the authoritarian comforts offered by Nehemiah Scudder.
It fundamentally recontextualizes the triumph of space exploration in Heinlein's universe. The stars were conquered, the solar system was industrialized, but the cost of that outward expansion was the soul and the liberty of the Earth.
The pioneers escaped the gravity well, but they abandoned their home to a monster.
So, what does this all mean for us, sitting here absorbing this dense, brilliant world building? When we look back at the entire sweep of inelibism, if this goes on, from the intricate logistics of a Masonic underground resistance to the devastating theory of a frontier-induced brain drain, what is the ultimate takeaway?
I believe the enduring value of Heinlein's work here is his demonstration of science fiction as a rigorous sociological laboratory. He is demanding that we look at the mechanics of our own society, not just the technology.
Right.
In an era characterized by unprecedented mass communication and algorithmic information overload, his warnings from 1940 feel shockingly prescient to you and me today. His fear regarding our infinite capacity to swallow nonsense is a direct challenge to the modern listener.
It really is.
It serves as a stark encouragement to critically evaluate the media we consume, to demand linguistic precision from our leaders, and to deeply understand the structural scaffolding of the society we live in.
It is a demand for active, highly critical citizenship. We cannot assume that the mechanisms of democracy will simply maintain themselves.
No, we can't.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought that builds directly on Ward Carson's theory of the frontier.
It's a heavy one.
Think about the world we live in today. If the most innovative, well-resourced, and boundary-pushing minds in our society decide to abandon the messy, frustrating realities of the civic square in favor of a new frontier, whether that is literally spending billions to colonize Mars, retreating into exclusive, unregulated digital realms, or isolating themselves in fortified, ideologically pure communities, who are they leaving the levers of power to back home?
Exactly.
If the pursuit of the future requires the brightest minds to exit the room, who is left behind to turn out the lights? Is the relentless drive to conquer a new frontier actually just a glamorous surrender of the old one?
It is a haunting question, and it guarantees that the core anxieties of if this goes on will remain relevant for generations to come.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly dense, fascinating journey through Heinlein's universe. We love unpacking these complex sociological puzzles with you. Keep questioning the narratives around you, keep exploring those hidden literary histories, and we will see you on the next deep dive.